bright, sanitized spaces of our office compound. He had worked at the company for a while and had stories to tell of the strange things people do and become in the modern corporate world. Endlessly on fluorescent lights, endless carpeted corridors, endless team meetings, endless salad bars in the food hall, endless small talk, lots of endlessness. We coped with our situation by narrating it in gothic, uncanny proportions to one another. So we imagined grimy, broken laptops and keyboards and mice dumped into our office at regular intervals through massive chutes in the wall, because resourcing just thought we needed new equipment. We imagined out-of-date cybersecurity posters as bearers of occult messages. We imagined the lonely interior life of the automated mail cart. We imagined the interior life of those around us who didn't feel the strangeness of it all. And this was kind of our way of comprehending that feeling of emptiness and endlessness. Our vignettes helped me survive those early career years. They also began my interest in liminal spaces, places where, as Peter Heff describes, the world as such becomes decoupled from its appearance, where vacuousness, whether physical, mental, or emotional, implies the uncanny presence of something other. Originally used by anthropologists to describe rites of passage and ritual, liminality is fundamentally, quote, fundamentally an idea about thresholds and grand moments of change. As a subject becomes separated and enters the marginal or liminal phase, not only does the world around them change in meaning, but they become other, end quote. In order to return to society's mature adult, adolescents are cut off from the familiar world and required to overcome the ambiguous, overwhelming liminal experience. Liminal spaces are where things and people are no longer as they seem. By imagining our insurance company as a liminal space, my friend and I tried to imbue it with a meaning greater than it offered. We were also unwittingly participating in a genre that's been dubbed bureaumancy, epitomized in Charles Strauss's Laundry Files novels, which intermingle the occult with office life. I also have the internet to thank for my interest in liminality and bureaumancy, where images of uncanny spaces abound. We see them in images from subreddits like liminal space, urban exploration, and abandoned retail subreddits, where people share images of architectural decay and nostalgic oddities. We also see it in the viral image, The Backrooms, which was just posted to Reddit kind of without much context, but it spawned an urban legend and helped inspire the TV show Severance, if you've seen that, which is kind of about corporate dystopia. My Instagram feed is full of images like this from photographers like Brendan Burton, someone named Ellul, and they kind of play with grim bureaucratic tropes. I've even contributed to this theme myself a bit, published a photo book a number of years ago of empty spaces and detritus that I called Fallen Things. And here's some images from that. A lot of abandoned places and things I would see on walks with my dog. And I started wondering, why are we interested in these images? And I know not everybody is, but I am, and it seems like a fair amount of the internet is. And I read an interesting article by a photographer named Steven Siegel, who photographed urban blight in New York in the 70s and 80s. And he locates our interest in the fact that these are images of ruins, even if they're somewhat recent. And the ruins inevitably invoke our inevitable deaths. Quoting him, "They remind us of our own mortality and of the simple fact that nothing, no matter how seemingly solid, will persist in time. Yet our experience of ruins isn't really morbid. They also evoke childlike wonder at the entry of chaos into the world of adult order." Quoting him again, "As we grow up, most of us come to accept the need to impose order on our living spaces and on our lives. Thus, the heightened wonder that we all experience with ruins is a flashback to the child's view of the world. We are all fascinated by chaos and its effects." In a society fully enclosed within technique, empty malls, abandoned office parks, and derelict basements serve as a kind of comfort that this isn't all there is, that the endless corridors aren't in fact endless, that we aren't fully in control of our environment, that technique doesn't have the final say. If, as David Levkin writes in, quote, "Modern society, the ultimate real is absolute rationality, technique, and therefore technique is the, quote, current mystery, images of liminal spaces recalibrate our sense of reality by envisioning the porousness of the technological milieu. its artificiality, its vulnerability to entropy, its ultimate irrationality. And it's maybe the case that images like these give a false comfort. Given Ellul's ambivalence about the truth-telling potential of images, which he elaborates in Humiliation of the Word, he writes, "Images are essential if I am to avoid seeing the day-to-day reality in which I live. They often deceive us." And given Ellul's confidence that technique can't be transcended, it's tempting to dismiss photographs like these as mere escapism from the strictures of unbridled rationalism and labor alienation in the technological society. Scenes that give us the feeling of insight, yet are powerless to affect meaningful consciousness of technique. And many of these images of liminal spaces don't rise above the level of being mere aesthetic chaff, or, as the kids say, a vibe. However, I want to argue that certain images can arise from the technological society that play with its cliches, horror, recursion, and irrationality without succumbing to these things or reinforcing them. That, in fact, these kinds of images are even necessary to a critical awareness of technique. If technique's primary strategy of propagation is to pacify its subjects into acceptance of irrationality, then, as with the political illusion, we need means for, quote, quoting Ellul here, developing and multiplying tensions, end quote, to vividly and imaginatively represent its irrationality. Images can do that. The risk, of course, is that images can simply stun viewers into shocked passivity, as Ellul writes in Empire of Nonsense, in the context of the technological society, given the nature of man as we know him. The depiction of horror produces no positive reaction. It is simply an intensification of the horror. And most dystopian imagery and sci-fi horror suffers from this overreach, showing the terror of being human in the technological wilderness, yet not providing a vantage point for a deeper, radical awareness of our true situation. An awareness that Ellul argues is only possible through verbal discourse. Yet the humor and humility expressed in certain surreal works make them particularly apt for imagining the life of technique and our life within it, avoiding the pitfalls that Ellul rightfully critiques. I'll take a look at a couple works, the photography of Lars Tembjork and the video game Control, each of which present the workplace as a liminal space, reimagining the domain in which we're perhaps most vulnerable to techniques, events, and incursions. We'll look at Tembjork's works first. So, corporate office culture reached its sublime peak at the turn of the century. We survived Y2K, the British version of The Office premiered, social media hadn't rotted our minds, AI wasn't the specter it's become, and we worked together in person every day. It was the height of a specific kind of techno-optimism that made highly visible our simultaneous admiration and resentment of the technological environment. Candid everyday images from this era, however, are understandably rare given corporate security concerns and lack of iPhone cameras at the time. However, Tembjork, a Swedish photographer known for his stark, wry portraiture, worked with the New York Times to gain access to corporate offices around the world to make his photo book, Contour Office, published in 2001. Describing his previous photo assignments and inspiration for this book, he notes that he, quote, photographed a lot of empty interiors, welfare offices, just after family therapy, empty reception rooms. He noticed that even after the people left, a feeling of them stayed in the room, a sense of sadness. Tembjork wondered if he could capture that same lingering sadness in corporate offices, which he calls, quote, the most common but closed and secretive place in the Western world. So here's some of his images. Tuned to the liminality of these spaces, their, quote, lingering sadness, they bear witness to very human spontaneity, sorrow, and strangeness in the midst of the irrational repetition and inhospitable space of the office. A woman kneeling before corporate propaganda. A vortex seen in an empty trash bin. Colleagues statuesque in front of a high-rise window, one admiring the outdoor view, the other the building's interior. Cubicles portrayed as an endless maze. At first glance, his images are painfully banal. Yet taken together, they illustrate Ellul's insight that the individual cannot be absent from his work without great injury to himself. Work is an expression of life, end quote. Tembjork's images show life expressing itself against the odds, people resisting that flattening, the ironing that Jennifer mentioned yesterday. And the saving grace of his images is their humor and the tension they create between human spontaneity and technological determinism. Shot in a candid documentary style, his images are ironic without condescending to their subject, surreal without drifting into dystopian fantasy, institutional yet intimate, horrific yet hilarious. What makes them remarkable is Tom Bjork's discovery of unselfconscious play and goofiness in the midst of lifeless bureaucratic settings. His subjects aren't agitators actively protesting against the system. They're everyday people unconsciously resisting their environment to tragicomic effect. People just being people in a technological environment. So when Tom Bjork calls The Office the most common but closed and secretive place in the Western world, he echoes Ellul's thoughts on the deliberate cultic obscurity of administrations and the impossibility of human freedom within them. This is from Humiliation of the Word. And I think with these images, both Tom Bjork and the video game Control, which I'll show in a minute, I'm curious how people try to have open, autonomous relationships with bureaucracies. That's really interesting tension to me, and especially when people try to express it visually. So this struggle is it's central to the game Control, which is it came out in 2019 by Remedy, which is a production house. And it's very much a bureaumantic horror video game that imagines the workplace in far more surreal terms than Tom Bjork did. So in the game, you play as Jesse Faden, and you're exploring the headquarters of what's called the Federal Bureau of Control, which is a mysterious government agency in charge of protecting the world from paranormal forces. So think like Men in Black meets Sixth Sense. The game centers on Jessie's role as the Bureau's new director and her efforts to rid the Bureau of a malevolent presence ominously called the Hiss. The game takes place entirely inside the Bureau's headquarters, a shape-shifting office building called the Oldest House, which takes inspiration from mid-century brutalist municipal architecture. It calls to mind Ellul's comment that, quote, "Man was created for a living environment, but he dwells in one of a lunar world of stone, cement, asphalt, glass, cast iron, and steel." Ellul's use of lunar here is apt, given the multidimensionality of space in the Oldest House, how a subterranean floor, the quarry threshold, contains a seeming universe unto itself. Space in the Oldest House is often distorted, paradoxical, and seemingly infinite. With guidance from the board, a disembodied voice that intermittently sends garbled messages to Faden, she gains paranormal powers over the course of the game that make her increasingly adept at manipulating the environment and combating this mysterious hiss. By the end of the game, players can alter the configuration of entire floors, create shields out of desks and whiteboards, hurl chairs at enemies. Yet even as her autonomy grows, Faden is never fully able to control the Oldest House or her fate within it. After finishing the final level, players are shown, predictably, the game's closing credits, which seem normal at first, but then they go haywire and kind of get distorted. And the game then seemingly starts over, with Faden now robbed of her powers and in the position of a new hire in the Bureau, performing menial tasks for overbearing managers. At this point, players are essentially put through an office simulator game, endlessly delivering memos to empty desks, until Faden discovers that she's actually been possessed by the Hiss and is experiencing a surreal dream of servitude. The dream ends when she finds and kills the building's former director. Control is decidedly a terrifying game. I did not play it with the lights off. Pitting players against paranormal, bureaucratic forces, at one point even fighting against a version of herself, the game imagines what life might be like in Hegel's Bad Infinity, in which technique becomes, as David Levkin puts it, a disembodied abstraction, endlessly embodied. And like Tom Bjork's photos, Control creates an uncanny tension between the banal and the fantastic, as it visualizes the lengths to which we go to survive our technical environment. What makes each of these works compelling to me is their utter absence of ideology. The liminality present in Control and Contra Office is ambiguous, both a threat and a hope. The incursions of technique are countered by disarming humor, even gentleness at times, hinting that the way to resist technique isn't by using its own devices, literally and figuratively, but by following a different rationality, one founded in wonder, play, and even grace. Ellul claims that the technical system is in no danger from an art that is conditioned by that very system. And it's arguable that of all media, photography and video games are the most open to this critique. However, if it's also true that wonder is the enemy of technique, I'm quoting David Levkin, then it follows that genuine experiences of wonder, experiences that aren't really wonder at the marvels of technique, what David Nye calls the technological sublime, can draw us into a truer awareness of our human state in a technological society, where we're both determined by the environment we've created, yet free to act within it. Depictions of workplace liminality are particularly apt for imparting that kind of vision. Images of people maintaining their humanity in technical environments beyond their control remind us of the creation that humanity has forgotten, but which it must not forget, again quoting Levkin. Images do this when they express the complex reality of being human in the technological society, and the experience of determinism and freedom, futility and potential, excess rationalism, and irrational play that entails, when images approach dialectic expression, in other words. To wrap up, the phrase "deus ex machina," God from the machine, is how it's translated. It's a cliche that's often used to cast an ominous tone on technological progress, especially in the realm of AI. Its origins, though, are much more quaint, coming from Greek theater, where actors were brought on stage using a machine, hence deus ex machina, and it was usually either a crane or a trapdoor. And they were brought on stage to swiftly, sometimes preposterously, resolve a central conflict. The ghost was a presence of literal and figurative artifice, disruptive yet necessary to the progress of the narrative. And that's kind of how I've come to think of images like this, liminal images. I've come to think of liminal images in these terms, especially uncanny images of the workplace, which are particularly relevant in a moment when modern work is composed increasingly of false images, epitomized by the Zoom chat window. Our sense of reality and ourselves in the technological environment, is conditioned by reductive images which tell us that our lives are either completely free, a form of hopeless optimism, or fully determined, a form of hopeless pessimism. Neither are completely true, of course, a point which Ellul briefly addresses in his second foreword to the technological society, where he disclaims the pessimism of which he's been accused. He writes, "I do not seek to show, say, that man is determined, or that technique is bad, or anything else of the kind. Liminal images like the ones we looked at undermine techno-optimism at the same time that they undermine techno-nihilism. They give visions of creative survival in the technological wilderness which, like Ellul's book, don't resolve the problems of the technological society as much as they convey the ambiguous truth of our predicament." Thanks.